History as it happens, October 20th, 2022, when America failed the Jews.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Deutsches Vaterland und deutsches Volk und Heiliges Reich der Zukunft.
If any of these groups, the British, the Jewish, or the administration, stops agitating for war, I believe there will be little danger of our involvement.
This rise of intolerance in Germany today, the suffering being inflicted on an innocent and helpless people, grieve every decent American.
We know now that a nation that can have peace with the Nazis only at the price of total surrender.
Ken Burns has turned his lens on the U.S. response to the Holocaust and the critically important years before the war, when hundreds of thousands of Jews tried to flee Nazi persecution, but faced an American public that did not want them and a U.S. administration unwilling to help enough of them. The seeds of this moral failure were planted long before the Holocaust began, and they hold important lessons for the way we deal with refugees today. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And that a hierarchy of nations, of people, can be put in place with some nations, some immigrants, deemed better than others, more fit to be American. It is no coincidence that these tended to be countries that produced white Protestant immigrants, which echoed the white Protestant nature of the scientists who were saying, well, the best immigrants are white Protestants.
On September 11, 1941, 3 months before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, heroic aviator and American isolationist Charles Lindbergh delivered a speech in Des Moines, Iowa that Hitler may have approved had he been in attendance. Lindbergh blamed the British, the Roosevelt administration, and Jews for trying to drag the United States into the European war.
In selecting these three groups as the major agitators for war, I have included only those whose support is essential to the war party. If any of these groups, the British, the Jewish, or the administration, stops agitating for war, I believe there will be little danger of our involvement.
Antisemitism was common in America at that time, even if it wasn't as crude or violent as the Nazi kind. Father Charles Coughlin, speaking to his audience of millions on the radio in November 1938, as Nazi violence against the Jews in the Night of the Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, made international headlines, said the violence was justified because it was sort of a self-defense mechanism against communism, whose leaders were, you guessed it, atheistic Jews.
It is my opinion that Nazism, the effect of communism, cannot be liquidated in its prosecution complex until the religious Jews in high places, in synagogue and finance, radio and press, attack the cause, attack its forthright, and the errors and the spread of communism, together with all our co-nationals who support it.
Antisemitism, isolationism, nativism, xenophobia, eugenics created an atmosphere where immigrants were unwanted even as Americans expressed revulsion at Nazi behavior. Also in November 1938, FDR released a statement condemning the violence of Kristallnacht, although it did not specifically mention Jews. Former President Herbert Hoover added his voice to the chorus of condemnation.
It raises our every sense of indignation and our every resentment. It makes us fearful for the whole progress of civilization. It is our hope that those springs of tolerance and morals and of human compassion which lie deep in the German people may yet rise to control.
But the outrage did not translate to a more welcoming climate for, by this point, the hundreds of thousands of Jews trying to get out of Germany and territory seized by the Third Reich in Austria and elsewhere. But well before Hitler was levered into power in January 1933, and well before the Great Depression made the idea of accepting poor job seekers into the country even more unpopular, an anti-immigration backlash culminated in federal legislation in 1924, closing an era of mass emigration to the United States at Ellis Island, where millions of Europeans had entered from 1892 on. This period and these attitudes are detailed in Ken Burns' new documentary on PBS, The U.S. and the Holocaust. Among the historians who appear in the three-part series is Rebecca Erbelding, an expert on the U.S. response to the Nazi genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, and an independent scholarly advisor to the Burns documentary. She is also the author of Rescue Board, the untold story of America's efforts to save the Jews of Europe. And she is speaking for herself today, not for the museum where she works. We are honored to have her on the podcast. Rebecca Erbelding, welcome to the studio.
Thank you so much for having me.
I feel like I've just seen you. Well, because I have. I've been watching you on television, but you tell me those interviews were done several years ago for the Ken Burns documentary.
I think my interview was October 2018. It was funny, after the film came out, there was an article that said, it's amazing that they got these survivors 10, 15 years ago to talk about this. And I said, no, they were done in 2019, 2020. Everybody's interviews were pretty recent. But the survivors do such an amazing job in that film that people assumed they couldn't possibly be 98, 99, 100 years old, but they are.
They were the most touching stories in what was an otherwise, and out of necessity, grim story, depressing story, because it is. We're talking about genocide. But there were a few uplifting moments when the survivors talk about how they finally made it to Ellis Island. Congratulations on your contribution to that very important documentary that we're going to talk about here today. One thing I liked about it was it started off with a lot of context about late 19th century, early 20th century America. So that's where we're going to start, Rebecca. You know, our history tells us millions of Europeans emigrated to the United States and passed through Ellis Island with hardly a question asked and with little regard for where they were going. And that is true. In 1907 alone, more than 1 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island, and they didn't even need papers at the time. And between 1880 and 1920, some 2 million Jews from Southern and Eastern Europe came to the United States, among the many millions of immigrants from that continent and elsewhere. So the gate was open, but that does not mean that everyone was welcomed with open arms. So what was the nativist reaction, the growing backlash to all this immigration starting in the early 20th century?
Well, it really starts with questions of race. So you look at the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement, which restricted immigration from Japan. So it begins as a question of race. So the door is open for the most part, but there are still restrictions on people with physical and mental disabilities are not allowed to immigrate. Anyone who's openly gay is not allowed to immigrate. The United States is very careful about who will be able to support themselves in the United States. But you're right. For most of Ellis Island, it's a very cursory interview, quick medical check, and other than that, generally most people are allowed to enter the United States. But as the 20th century begins, this large immigration pool mixes with another phenomenon that is happening at the time, which is that science is really starting to take a hand in policy.
This is eugenics, right?
This is eugenics, absolutely. This is eugenics. So people who believe that science can help us better society decide that humans can be biologically categorized and that a hierarchy of nations, of people, can be put in place with some nations, some immigrants, deemed better than others, more fit to be American. It is no coincidence that these tended to be countries that produced white Protestant immigrants, which echoed the white Protestant nature of the scientists who were saying, well, the best immigrants are white Protestants. It's funny how people who believe in racial science always have themselves and people like them as the head and the best of the categories.
And this was junk science, really, but it was embraced by the elites in society, progressives in the United States, who were worried about that the American race, if you will, was being contaminated by all these immigrants. They equated ethnicity with nationality, or was it the other way around? Basically, depending on what country you were from, determined your racial purity. It was...
Right, and anything you know about Europe, you know that there is no 100% French line that is not German, that is not Spanish. You know, the idea that countries are isolated in Europe is ridiculous, but this is what these people said, and it got codified into U.S. immigration law in 1924.
Yeah, we're moving towards 1924. 1924 is the first big year here in this story about the American response to the Holocaust. In the 1920s, 1930s, how widespread was anti-Semitism in the United States?
It was quite widespread, anti-Semitism. The 1930s, you actually see, from what we can tell through polling, through different pieces of information, there's actually a spike in anti-Semitism in the 1930s. A lot of it is nativist and isolationist, anti-immigrant and prejudiced. With the Depression, you look for scapegoats, and historically, for centuries, Jews have been scapegoats of every nation's problems, unfairly.
So we're talking about the attitudes and the ideas that underpinned this nativist backlash. In the 1920s, though, the U.S. economy was in pretty good shape. So it sounds like the 1924 legislation and the quotas that it produced were simply targeting ethnic groups.
Right. It's not really a response to economics. The Great Depression won't hit for another 5 years, but it is a response to isolationism, this idea that after World War I, we should just stay on our side of the Atlantic from now on. It is a problem. We went overseas. It didn't work out. Thank God for the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. We can stay over here and everything will be fine. It's a reaction, I think, a little bit to the Spanish flu pandemic, which, again, was perceived to have come from Europe. We now know that it actually didn't. It came from the United States, but there's a perception that it had come from Europe. And there's a fear of political instability. You see the Russian Revolution, you see violence on the streets of Europe in the wake of World War I, as street gangs kind of battled it out for political power. That's going on in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s.
Fear of communism.
Right, and there are anarchist bombings here in the U.S. in 1919, 1920, 1921. And so I think all of this is a backlash to the idea of foreignness in general. And of course, anti-Semitism and xenophobia is wrapped up in all of that.
So how dramatically did the 1924 bill restrict immigration? And who was mostly affected by this? Obviously, Jews were one group.
The 1924 law is a huge change in the way that immigration is conducted. So no longer do ships arrive at Ellis Island, you show your paperwork, and then they decide. Suddenly, immigration is put in the hands of the State Department in consulates located abroad. And so if you plan to immigrate to the United States, you now need to wait in your country of birth or your country of residence to present your paperwork to a State Department consular official where you're living, and then obtain a visa there. So Ellis Island really becomes a holding pen only for people who don't pass the very cursory exam they get in the U.S. The real exam is done back in Europe or in your country of residence. The 1924 law effectively decimates immigration, and I use that literally. You talked about 1907 when more than 1 million people arrived. Suddenly after 1924, there's a cap, and that cap at first is 164,000 people. And then in 1929, that is lowered again to 153,000 people. That is the cap. That is not the goal that the State Department is trying to hit. That is the legal maximum for all immigration from quota countries. And quota countries involved the vast majority of the world. Now, some areas, including parts of Asia, had a quota of 0. You could not immigrate from those countries if you were born there. For Europe, the vast majority of the visas were available for Europe, only about 1,100 for all of Africa. And then that quota, that 153,000, was broken down by country. And that was all based in eugenics. So countries that produce so-called good immigrants got larger pieces of the pie than countries, for example, in Southern and Eastern Europe, where Jews and Catholics tended to live.
My last name is DeCaro, so you can probably guess where my family comes from. As far as I know, they all got here prior to 1924. I mentioned before, 2 million Jews made it to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe, 1880 to 1920, and they were coming here because there was already mistreatment in Europe, so they were already fleeing persecution. And here in the United States, there are people who thought this law didn't go far enough, right? There were people who wanted to entirely shut off immigration, right?
Yes, that's a huge debate in Congress, especially right after World War I in 1921. They discussed cutting off all immigration for an entire year and just kind of seeing how that goes. They ended up having an emergency quota act that was then replaced in 1924. So there are many, many people who think that this 1924 law doesn't go far enough.
Something else is happening in 1924. Adolf Hitler is spending 264 days of that year in prison. He got off lightly. Some people said he should have been hanged or shot because he tried to overthrow the government of Bavaria in his beer hall push the year before. The reason I'm bringing this up, Rebecca, is because in 24, no one believes Adolf Hitler, maybe not even him at this point, within a decade is going to become the most powerful head of state in Europe. And this raises the intentionalist versus structuralist debate that historians have been having for quite a long time. Ian Kershaw's work on this debate has influenced my thinking a great deal. And I bring this up because when we look back on events with the benefit of hindsight and we want to hold people accountable for not doing enough to save the Jews of Europe, we also have to judge them based on what they reasonably could have expected at the time. So let's start with 1924 and the Nazi movement. At that point, it really is on the margins. It's almost dead, right?
I think you're right to talk about what was reasonably expected. I don't think the idea that Hitler would ever become Chancellor of Germany was reasonably expected in 1924. And then I think when he does become Chancellor, and Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany, the Nazis never take a majority in any sort of election. When he does become appointed Chancellor of Germany, there's a strong feeling, I think, even among Jewish Germans, that there's no way he's going to last. The Weimar Republic had been so fragile since it was established at the end of World War I. They had gone through multiple chancellors. The idea that this guy is going to be the one that sticks around seemed ridiculous. Part of the reason that I think many people were indifferent to him being put in place is because he'll fail and then he'll be gone.
And he was levered into power by the conservative nationalists in the government of Germany because they believed they could control this bohemian corporal, right?
Correct. Absolutely.
But he had already been talking or ranting about eliminating, which I guess is different in a certain way than physically exterminating, but eliminating Jews from German society. I brought up the intentionalist versus structuralist debate. When did Nazis and when did Hitler decide that they were going to kill the Jews, eliminate the Jews from German society? He had been talking about eliminating Jews from German society in all of Europe for quite a while. But, I mean, who took him seriously about this?
10% of the Jewish population of Germany leaves in the first year. But where do they go? Very few try to come to the United States, in part because we had started to institute a public charge clause, making it very difficult for people to prove that they could financially support themselves in the U.S. This is during the Depression now. And so very few people come to the U.S. in 1933. The vast majority of German Jews who do flee go to neighboring countries. They go to France, they go to Belgium, they go to the Netherlands. Otto Frank, for example, the father of Anne Frank, takes his family to Amsterdam, thinking this is a place that's nearby enough. I can still be with my family in Germany on holidays and then go home. And then as soon as this man is gone, we will return to our lives in Germany.
After he takes power in 1933, it becomes obvious pretty quickly that they're going to begin discriminating against Jews and, as I said, eliminating them from, well, citizenship, making it basically illegal for them to live. But this is a cumulative process, right?
Yes. So the first wave of anti-Jewish legislation is in the spring of 1933, not long after Hitler is appointed chancellor in January. So Jews are kicked out of the civil service unless they had been a veteran of World War I. There's a Nazi-supported boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. There's the burning of books in May 1933. And then it starts to quiet down a little bit. And part of the reason it starts to quiet down is there is an international outcry, including in the United States. There are rallies and marches and petitions sent to the State Department of average Americans saying something terrible is happening in Germany. Why isn't the State Department doing something about that? And Hitler sees that too. He is very aware of international prestige and the need to maintain diplomatic and economic relations. And so he is always watching, he is always calculating.
Why was the State Department so unhelpful during this drama? Right from the beginning, when Jews start to request visas to get here, to escape Hitler.
There are a couple of reasons. First, I'll address why the State Department doesn't protest right away when there is this first wave of anti-Jewish legislation. First, because American investors and businessmen had bought up $2 billion worth of German war debt. That is billion with a B. That is an incredible amount of money in the 1930s, equivalent of about $30 billion today. And there was a fear, especially during the Depression, that the Nazis might just unilaterally cancel that debt. That was something that the State Department wasn't willing to risk. They were also really afraid of accusations of hypocrisy. The State Department issues a formal protest against what the Nazis are doing to Jews in Germany. Germany turns around and issues a formal protest as to what American states are doing to blacks in the South. They're also just getting their feet under them in the Roosevelt administration. The Roosevelt administration begins in March 1933, at a time when the presidential inauguration was March 4th. They are still figuring out what to do. They don't have an ambassador in Germany until the summer. In terms of visas, the State Department is operating under instruction from Herbert Hoover from September 1930, in which he instructed the State Department to strictly enforce this public charge clause. It had not really been enforced that heavily before, but during the Depression, Hoover said this is a way that we can control who is coming into the United States, make sure these people can support themselves. And the State Department went forth with gusto to enforce this clause.
There were many anti-Semites in the State Department.
Yes, there are many anti-Semites in the State Department. At this point, Jewish immigration isn't the majority. There's nothing to escape yet. But when Jewish immigration, when anecdotally we know the majority of applicants were Jews, they are still enforcing very heavily this public charge clause.
And at some point, the Nazis stripped Jews of all their property and basically all their money, making them poor in an attempt to kick them out of the country. I mentioned before, when did Hitler determine that they wanted to not just get rid of Jews from society, but physically exterminate them? The initial idea was to just kick them out of the country, force them to leave, but they made them so poor that they couldn't meet the standards of this public charge law here in the United States, right?
Right. It's really until after World War II begins that the Nazis start to move towards the idea of physical extermination. Until then, Nazi policy is to get them out of Germany and then to get them out of Nazi-controlled territory. They butt up against two things. One, as you rightly said, they are impoverishing Jews before allowing them to leave, which made them very poor candidates for countries that are struggling under the Depression, who have requirements for a certain amount of money that you must bring with you. This was perfect for the Nazis because they got to keep the wealth and they also got to point at the hypocrisy, which they absolutely loved to do. So you want these people, they are coming to you, we've taken all their money. Oh, you don't want them because they're poor. Well, you must not care about the Jews if you don't want them.
As a historian, where do you fall in this debate I mentioned before? It sounds so academic, the structuralists and the intentionalists.
I think if you read Mein Kampf, you will see that Hitler had a lot of these ideas. You have to wade through Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf is not a coherent argument.
It's turgid.
It is. Turgid is a good word for it. It is incoherent, a lot of it. But he talks about living space. Anti-Semitism is virulent and omnipresent. Franklin Roosevelt read Mein Kampf in the original German. He could read German. And so he was aware that these were Hitler's policies. But again,
I think his dreams or his ideas.
His dreams, his ideas. But I don't think the Nazis realistically think that this is possible. Getting them out of Nazi space was good enough.
The Jews, you mean?
The Jews, yes, until the war begins. And the problem is Hitler's two goals are making Germany Judenrein, free of Jews, and territorial aggression. The Lebensraum that he wants, the living space, is in areas of Eastern Europe where there are millions of Jews living. His desire for living space is butting up against his desire for a Jewish-free Germany. And when the war begins and there's no longer any kind of idea that these people will leave, they talk about and actually formulate plans to send Jews to Madagascar, to kick Jews out in some other way. None of those things are plausible and real in a time of war. And then they realize that they can exterminate people inside Nazi-controlled territory and that no one from the outside world will be there to witness it.
A cruel irony here was Hitler mocking the Western powers, basically any country in the world, for not wanting to take the Jews. So he was being criticized for his cruel policies of marginalizing Jews, basically making it illegal for them to even live, but then turning the tables and saying, well, you won't take them either. You won't take them either. Yeah. And the war does give the Nazis, and not just the Nazis. I mean, they were the chief perpetrators of the Holocaust, but they did have help. The war does give them then the opportunity that they didn't have before to proceed with physical extermination. So before we get to the war, let's stay in the 1930s. I have a lot of questions about what's going on in the United States at that time. Americans see this, right? I mean, this is a major point of the documentary that you were in, the Ken Burns show. Americans can see what's happening to the Jews from 1933 on.
This is the golden age of newspaper journalism. There are over 2,000 daily newspapers in the United States in 1933, and many more weeklies. And a lot of these newspapers, especially the major dailies, had correspondents in Europe, including in Berlin. At least 75 newspaper correspondents, Americans, living in Berlin, reporting what they are seeing on the ground in 1933. Newspaper coverage changes, of course, over the course of the Third Reich, but for most of the 1930s, there's incredible first-person reporting that is available in American newspapers and on American radio. And so Americans do have this information. It is being crowded out by things that Americans tended to care more about. The Great Depression, for example, the New Deal, these kind of domestic concerns. We look back and we say, oh, there should have been so much more reporting. And I think there should have been. At the same time, we're looking back with the hindsight of knowing that this is all going to culminate in something. And I think at the time, it was harder to be able to say, we know where this is going.
You watch the documentary and you see the newspaper clippings and you're almost shouting at the TV. Do something. Please do something, because look what's going to happen to all these people. They're all going to be dead within a few years. Yet, even though Americans expressed revulsion at what was going on, that didn't translate to tolerance for more migrants, right?
Oh, absolutely not. The United States did not have a refugee policy until after World War II. So everyone who is trying to come is coming as an immigrant. There's no idea of migrant or asylum seeker or refugee. So we talk about Jewish refugees, but refugees under U.S. law get no special dispensation, no special part of the quota. The only thing that is given to refugees is you are not subjected to the literacy test as part of your immigration interview.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, the documentary makes a point of pointing to polls at the time. I guess these were the early polls, early public opinion polls. Do you approve of how the Nazis are treating the Jews? Most people would say no. Do you want to allow more Jews into the country?
Also no.
Also no, which is tragic. So, Franklin Roosevelt. Where do you stand on Roosevelt and how he performed in this period? Because he's been called a bystander, cruel and callous, indifferent. He's also been called the hero. My opinion is that the truth is somewhere in between those two poles.
Mine is that he's a politician. And he's a politician who has two priorities in his presidency, which lasts 12 years. The first is recovery from the Depression, and the second is victory in war. And everything else is subservient to that. There are times where you see Roosevelt make tremendous effort to bring the American people along with him on a policy or a program that, based on public opinion polling, we know they don't want. For example, getting Americans ready for what he sees as an inevitable war.
All the neutrality laws that he had to deal with.
Exactly. Right? He will fight and fight and fight, but that is towards the goal of victory in war. You do not see him make that same effort for immigration. I don't know what would have happened had he tried, and he gives us very little to work from. He doesn't live to write his memoirs. He doesn't take notes in meetings or allow people to take notes in meetings. He doesn't keep a diary. And so all we can say is, and all we can look at is what he did, and you can absolutely say that he could have done more.
I agree. You know, when we try to judge the past by our own standards, we have to be careful. But I don't think that's the issue here. I just did a couple of episodes at Mount Vernon talking about George Washington and slavery, 21st century versus the 18th century. This is very recent history, and I agree. Roosevelt could have and should have done more. But what power did he actually have? This is the era before the imperial presidency. He didn't have a lot of executive authority to say, repeal the quotas. That had to be done by Congress, right?
He can't repeal the quotas. He can say, I think we should repeal the quotas. That is one of the powers of the presidency, is the microphone. The ability to say what your policy proposals are and what you are willing to fight for, how you express American values to the American people or your administration's values to the American people. And that is absolutely something that he could have done. Would it have changed the quota laws? Would Congress have listened to him? I don't know.
He was worried that it would create even greater backlash if he spoke up too much.
And that is a real concern. It is important, and people point out all the time, the Democrats have a supermajority in Congress. They do, for the entirety of his presidency. But this is also a period of time in which the Democratic Party is starting to split apart. Northern Democrats are courting black votes, are courting immigrant votes. Southern Democrats, which have been a voting bloc since the end of the Civil War, are pro-segregation, are anti-immigrant. They control all the committees in Congress because of longevity. And so these are the people that Roosevelt needs to work through for his New Deal policies. And of course, that is always for him a priority over pushing immigration, pushing anti-lynching laws. He's not able to get any of that through, even if he wanted to, likely because of Congress.
He preferred to work behind the scenes when it came to the Jews. For instance, Latin America. He is credited with helping about 40,000 Jews reach Latin America from Europe by working behind the scenes. Do you agree with those estimates, or is that your take on it?
I have not looked at those documents, but I know it's Richard Brightman and Alan Lichtman's estimate.
I do have their book here.
Yeah, and I tend to trust them. I would be willing to go along with that. And that does really go along with how Roosevelt liked to work. There's a great book on Roosevelt called The Juggler. He really liked and I think delighted in the power of politics and the power that he wielded himself as president. And so working behind the scenes tended to be his mode.
FDR and the Jews, book by Richard Brightman and Alan Lichtman. I thought it was an excellent book. I'll return to some of their arguments in a moment. But when I read this book, when I watched the documentary, when I've read other things about this period in American history, I often wonder why did it seem the State Department had more power than the president? I often wondered why FDR couldn't do more to get the State Department to do what he wanted, since he was the president and it was his administration. The State Department was very powerful in those days.
The State Department was very powerful, and I think, again, Roosevelt is content to let the State Department run itself in certain ways. I don't think he necessarily is getting involved in questions of immigration. I don't think he's paying particular attention, particularly during the war, as to what Breckinridge Long is doing. Roosevelt tended to be a person who, once he decided someone was a friend, defended that person. And so
I don't want to interrupt, but Breckinridge Long, let's talk about him. He was a top-level official in the State Department, and he was an anti-Semite.
He was an anti-Semite. So Breckinridge Long begins as the U.S. ambassador to Italy. He comes back in the mid-1930s ostensibly for health reasons, though rumors circulate that he's come back because he was too excited about Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, which tracks. I wouldn't be surprised if that was true. He is then appointed back into the State Department at the outbreak of war, and he becomes an assistant secretary of state, one of a number of assistant secretaries, but he is given particular supervision of the visa division and is absolutely the wrong person for that role.
To your earlier points about Roosevelt having different priorities, understandably so, depression and war, Brightman and Lichtman write in their conclusion that when Roosevelt was preparing for a showdown with Congress on the Neutrality Acts in 1939, remember, Congress had tied his hands with a number of neutrality laws from 1935 to the onset of war. They say Roosevelt did not fight for a bill to admit refugee children outside immigration quotas. Roosevelt's one of my favorite presidents, but when I do read things like this, I'm disappointed. However, these same two scholars say that he was better than every other world leader on this issue, which maybe says the rest of the world was pretty terrible on it.
I think that's right.
On the issue I'm referring to is helping Jews escape.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that the reason that we can look at American immigration numbers from the 1930s, 1939, 1940, 1941, is because the U.S. does not actually close its doors. It closes them part way. It makes it incredibly difficult for people to come. There's active restriction. There are active new restrictions that the State Department is unilaterally putting in place to make it incredibly difficult for people to come. But the United States does not unilaterally close its doors to immigrants. There is still hope. Jewish immigrants still have hope at that point that they could potentially get to the United States.
And some do, although the waiting lists are in the hundreds of thousands, right?
The waiting list for people born in Germany by June 1939, so even before the outbreak of war, is over 300,000.
That's more than half of what the pre-war population of Germany was, right? Jewish population.
Yes. So we don't know, because the State Department did not track how many people on the waiting list were Jewish. We don't know that all 300,000 were. And we also have to be careful when we're talking about Jewish refugees to say, did they consider themselves Jewish, or are we using the Nazi construction of who is a Jewish refugee? But we know anecdotally from the State Department, from consular reports, that they are saying 90% of the people, more than 90% of the people who are applying, the Jews were the primary victim, but there were also people who were escaping for political reasons, who were escaping because they are persecuted as another group that the Nazis were targeting.
I should have mentioned when I brought up 1933, the first murder victims of the Nazi state were people with what we would call developmental disabilities today, mentally ill, mental patients. This was the euthanasia program. They were gassed by doctors.
I think the first instruction comes and is backdated, but it's dated to the beginning of the war, September 1st, 1939.
Okay. Thank you for correcting me there.
But
socialists were thrown in concentration camps.
Communists, yes. The first wave are reporters, such as yourself, who I assume would oppose the Nazi regime, socialists and communists, political opponents, and people who could have assumed positions of leadership against the regime.
And the Roma.
They're the ones who go first.
Yeah, the Roma, who are often called gypsies, the Sinti and the Roma, they're also persecuted during this time.
Gay men are persecuted as a group.
The clergy.
And the clergy.
So in FDR's second term, these two historians estimate his policies helped save the lives of over 100,000 Jews, although they note that the calculations have to be approximate. So they rate his first term not very good. He didn't say a lot about what was going on in Germany. And then in his second term, and this coincides with when Germany begins to expand territorially, the reoccupation of the Rhineland, the Anschluss with Austria, the rape of Czechoslovakia, beginning with the Sudetenland, and of course 1939, the invasion of Poland. Germany expands to the point where it now has millions more Jews in its orbit, including 3 million in Poland. So staying in the United States now, or returning to the United States, we know in a democracy that presidents, public officials have to take public opinion into account. We can look back on this period and say our leaders should have pushed harder to save lives, even if that is not what the public wanted in terms of more immigration. Yet at the same time, FDR had to deal with an isolationist public and also what you might call domestic movement. I mean, there were Nazi sympathizers in the United States, and there were men like Charles Lindbergh. How would you describe Lindbergh's politics? And when I was watching the documentary, I was trying to think of who today is a Charles Lindbergh, who today would have standing such as his with that type of megaphone, that type of platform, going up there and saying, let's leave Putin alone. He's not that bad of a guy. So how about I return to my question? How would you describe Charles Lindbergh's politics? And to my earlier point, why were his opinions so important, again, in a democracy where public opinion matters?
His opinions are important because he was an American hero and had been for a decade. People identified with him. They sympathized with him with the kidnapping and murder of his son and the long public trial. The Lindberghs had been in the public eye for more than a decade, and he was lionized. He was probably the most famous American, other than Franklin Roosevelt, in the world. The idea that people would listen to him should not come as a surprise. At the same time, he was an overt white supremacist. He would talk about how the white race needs to join together, England, Germany, to oppose any sort of threat to the purity of the race. He said that openly. And when war breaks out in Europe, he is convinced that there's no way that the Allies, at this point Britain and France, could possibly win against Germany, which at that point was allied with the Soviet Union.
And I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England, regardless of how much assistance we send.
And part of that was that he had been to Germany a number of times himself. He actually considered living there for a while. But he had been to Germany in part at the invitation of the U.S. government. There was a military attaché in Berlin who wanted to learn more about the Nazi remilitarization. And so he figured, who they would show off to is Charles Lindbergh. And so they got Lindbergh to come to Berlin so that he could tour the Luftwaffe plant and give information back to the U.S. government about what was happening there. And that worked. But it also convinced Lindbergh, looking at the Nazi machine, that there's no way that the Allies could win. And so he comes back. He is impressed by the state that the Nazis have built. He's not turned off that much by the anti-Semitism or by the white supremacy that the Nazis evince.
Apparently not, yeah.
No. And so he gives speeches on the radio, beginning with the outbreak of war, in which he talks about how he doesn't think the Allies could win. He covers up the white supremacism a little bit, and then finally, by September 1941, his anti-Semitism becomes apparent, and he is then shelved a bit by the America First Committee, which is the committee that is sending him out by then.
Yeah, he becomes more and more unhinged, it seems, as the years go on, and I think there was a straw that broke the camel's back, right? He gave one address that was really anti-Semitic.
On September 11th, 1941, in Des Moines, Iowa, and it's called Who Are the Warmongers?
If any of these groups, the British, the Jewish, or the administration, stops agitating for war, I believe there will be little danger of our involvement. I do not believe that any two of them are powerful enough to carry this country to war without the support of the third.
And he goes so far as to basically threaten American Jews to say, you should be the ones opposing this because you will be the first to feel the wrath. If we get involved in a war that is seen as a war for Jews.
Hitler said the same. Same thing.
And he said, I understand that Jews control the media and Jews control the banks. And it gets to the point where a magazine that I love, you can find them at antique stores. And if you do, you should pick it up and leaf through it. There's a magazine called Liberty. And Liberty magazine published a big page saying Charles Lindbergh, the most dangerous man in America. And they basically said, we leave it to you to say whether Lindbergh is a Nazi or not.
Charles Coughlin, Father Coughlin, he had a radio show that had tens of millions of listeners. He also is spewing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and bashing the Jews, but he's kind of coy or clever with the way he goes about this. I listened to some of his speeches, or I read some transcriptions. He says, I'm not for violence, I'm not for persecution. I don't hate Jews, I just don't like communists.
A couple of episodes ago, you and Sean Willens talked about Coughlin as a populist, and I think that's a really good way for it. And you're also right that a lot of his language is kind of caged. He talks about throwing the money lenders out of the temple, looking at the Reds. And these are phrases that I think are hard for us to read and understand now. They seem like dog whistles. It was not a dog whistle. It was a whistle in the 1930s. You could hear it, and that in part leads to Coughlin's downfall, is he, like Lindbergh, becomes more and more unhinged. He gives a radio address after Kristallnacht in November 1938.
That as long as misguided Jews and Gentiles both, and in such great numbers, continue to propagate the doctrines of anti-God, anti-Christ, anti-patriotism, and anti-property, so long there will always exist some defensive mechanism against communism.
And goes down kicking and screaming over the next couple of years, and then finally lives out his life as a parish priest.
Well, thank you for listening to the podcast with Sean Willens. You get a big thumbs up for that. And
okay, good.
We're going to get to 38 now, the start of the war. Kristallnacht. This really sealed the fate of Germany's Jews. But like the earlier acts of violence, while Americans did not like what they saw, and they did see this, I mean, this was not hidden from the American public. They could see what was going on in 1938. It didn't translate for a more liberal attitude about helping Jews get here. How important was Kristallnacht on the road to the Holocaust?
Kristallnacht is a turning point. It's always a problem to talk about history in chapters because history as it's lived is not in a chapter. You don't wake up one day and say, oh, now we're in this chapter. But Kristallnacht is a massive turning point. November 9th and 10th, 1938, it's a night of pogroms across Germany and German-controlled territory, which now includes Austria and the Sudetenland, in which synagogues are burned and houses of worship. 30,000 Jewish men and boys are arrested and sent to concentration camps. This is the first mass roundup of Jews just for being Jewish. It adds to this idea of we have to get out. So families who may have been waiting in Germany, may have been hesitant before, now join these waiting lists to apply and immigrate to the United States. Immigration doesn't stop at that point. 1938 is actually towards the beginning of what we call the refugee crisis, and that really lasts until 1941. So until 1941, there is still an ability, as fleeting as it is, for Jewish refugees to actually escape.
During this entire period, it's not like no one is getting here, but it doesn't nearly meet the demand.
Correct.
And events on the ground don't seem to push the needle one way or the other very much. That's what's so frustrating, because the situation is getting worse. Not just through hindsight. You could see it then. The situation was getting worse in Europe.
Right. There is violence, and Kristallnacht is front page news for about 3 weeks in November 1938. It actually displaces news of the midterm elections. The midterms had taken place 2 days earlier, before Kristallnacht, and if you look at newspapers from the time, the big headline is something like, Germans storm Jews, burn synagogues, and then smaller font it will say, GOP up 80.
Anti-Semitism in America wasn't the crude, eliminationist, violent type that we saw in Europe, right?
It depends on who you talk to. About 10% of Americans polled wanted to deport Jews from our own country. Wow. That was in 1938, 1939. This was absolutely a time in which colleges have quotas, golf clubs and social clubs would keep Jews out. This was a time where public anti-Semitism was still quite common.
The State Department hardly lifts a finger here, so it's up to volunteer groups to try to help, right? And there were many of those.
Many communities had their own refugee group. Part of it was to try to navigate the system. The State Department never made it clear, and deliberately so, what you actually needed to pass this public charge clause. Each individual consulate had its own list of this is the kind of documentation that you need. That was not provided by the main State Department. And so everyone is trying to navigate this moving target, right? This consulate is easier to get through because these consular officials are a little more sympathetic. So this is what you should do for this consulate. This one is a little stricter. So the advice is being given by these aid organizations, some of which are on the ground in the U.S. trying to help people find jobs, trying to help people find clothing and homes. Some have representatives in Europe who are trying to help families navigate the system and get all their paperwork done. And some are trying to connect the two, find sponsors in the U.S. for people who may not have family here.
So in the pre-war period, it was not physically impossible to get out of Europe. It was a question of finding a place that would take you. But when the war begins, it becomes much harder just to engage in the physical act of leaving Europe, right? It becomes a prison, would you say?
I think that's right. As soon as the war begins, you see ports in areas that are touched by the war close to U.S.-bound transportation. So in September 1933, ports in Germany close. You can no longer leave from Hamburg and get to the U.S. Ports in Poland close. In the spring of 1940, as the Nazis push west, ports in Antwerp, in Brussels, in the Netherlands and Belgium, in France, those closed to U.S.-bound transportation. So by the summer of 1940, if you physically want to escape by boat, which was the main means of transportation at the time, you actually have to get to Lisbon, Portugal. And that means getting entry and exit visas for all of the countries that you are going to travel through, and sometimes in a specific order. Spain won't let you in if you can't prove that Portugal will let you in, because Spain doesn't want you caught in their country.
Wow. When does what we today call the Holocaust begin? Do you date it to 1941, mid-1941, when the Nazis invade the Soviet Union?
I think we do have to look at what war can make possible. So there is certainly killing before that. In 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, there are tens of thousands of people who are rounded up and murdered. First, they start saying, well, just the men, they are partisans, and then women and children are the ears of the partisans, so we must take them too.
There were mass shootings in Poland. Yeah.
There are mass shootings, and I think it really does coalesce in the summer of 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union. That is when it is organized. That is when the Einsatzgruppen units are moving behind the army. And
they were
killing squads. They were mobile killing squads that worked with police units, the Wehrmacht, the German military, and also a lot of local collaborators to go into towns, round up the Jewish community, and then often within a few days take them to a remote area. There would be a mass shooting and people would be buried there.
And then after the Soviet invasion, or after the Holocaust by bullets, which you just referred to, the Einsatzgruppen, they move on to the death chambers. And by the end of 1942, most of the Jews who would be killed during this dark chapter of human history are dead by then. About 5 of the 6 million are already dead by the end of 42, early 43.
I think it's a little that's less? A little high.
Okay.
I think that's a little high, but it is striking how quickly this happens. 2/3 of the Jews who will be killed in the Holocaust are killed in about 20 months.
My gosh. 4 million people.
4 million people, and that is before the Allies, including the Americans, have any boot on the ground in Europe.
It was either you or one of the other fine scholars in the documentary made this point. By the time the war starts, it's in many ways too late. Jews had to be saved when you had a chance because the Allies don't invade Italy till 43. We get to France in 44. It was hard to reach places where all this murdering was happening.
Right. When we talk about the debate about bombing Auschwitz, for example, the Allies do not have access to fly over the area that includes Auschwitz and back on one tank of gas until the spring of 1944. I mean, this is why I think a lot of genocide scholars talk about early warning signs. Yes. Because you see that not just in the Holocaust, but in other genocides, that once a genocide begins, it is very difficult to get it to stop. And so what we have to do is prevent. We have to look at consistent early warning signs and try to disrupt what is happening before. Yes. And in the case of the Holocaust, I think the obvious answer is increased immigration.
On Auschwitz, there was contradictory information in the documentary about whether FDR was even asked about it or was consulted by the military. Someone much later after the war said, yeah, he did bring it to FDR's attention. But at the time, what's your take on this as a historian? Was he asked whether the military should try this?
There's no contemporary evidence that Roosevelt was ever asked about it. You're right. John McCloy, who was the Assistant Secretary of War, later said, and this is much later, this is in the 1980s, said that, oh, yes, he did actually go to Roosevelt. But by that point, part of McCloy's legacy is that he is the person who was consistently denying U.S. military forces to bomb the camp. And so I think part of that might have been trying to clear up his own legacy.
Okay. And in the documentary, you make a point about this issue, about it's an impossible question to answer.
I think it's a question that everyone can answer for themselves. I don't think I have any sort of special insight as a historian. You know, I can say this is what was known, this is what was done, this is what was not done. But the should have, I think, is up to everyone. And for me, it is a difficult question because I want the U.S. to have made a stronger stand. I want the U.S. to have known about there being a camp and have tried to disrupt the killing in a stronger way than we did. But is that answer bombing the camp? Knowing what we know about precision bombing, and that's something I go back and forth on all the time. Yeah.
Deborah Lipstadt, another great historian, she makes the following point in the documentary that maybe it wouldn't have saved many lives or any lives, maybe even killed people inside the camp if the bombs had hit the targets. But she said it would have sent a statement, a message about American priorities and values.
And I think a statement should have been made. I just don't know whether bombing is that statement. I have a harder time with that. And so I wanted a lot of smart people in a room in 1944 actually thinking about this and debating and how can we send a statement. And The military was not doing that. The military at no point really discusses or debates the logistics of what it might look like to send such a statement.
In their view, any diversion from winning the war had to be avoided. In their view, ending the war, defeating the Nazis was the best way to end the killing.
To some extent, they're right. The thing that stops the Holocaust is the defeat of Nazi Germany. But at the same time, we know that this is not really diverting that many resources because the Americans are bombing the area around
just a few miles away.
Auschwitz, just a few miles away. And so they have the logistics, they have the planes, they have the bombs. But what I would have liked is if a group in the military actually sat down and said, how should we do this? If the Roosevelt administration had decided as a group that we should send some sort of statement and then think about what that statement could have been. The War Refugee Board, the agency that I study, is active in 1944. That's when they're created. That's when they're active.
I was just about to ask you about the board.
Yeah, and they certainly feel like a statement should be made, but they think, well, this is a military question, and we need, for the longest time, they think we need to defer to the military on this. And the military just shelves it immediately. And so I agree with Deborah absolutely that we needed some sort of statement. I just go back and forth in my own mind as to what that statement could and should have been.
So the War Refugee Board, you've written an authoritative book about this, created by Roosevelt in 1944. What does it accomplish?
The War Refugee Board accomplishes quite a lot. In the 17 months that it is active during World War II, they saved tens of thousands of lives and aid hundreds of thousands of people. Almost everything that has to do with the Holocaust in 1944, 1945 crossed their desk. They allow humanitarian aid organizations for the first time to send money into enemy territory, millions of dollars worth of humanitarian aid, and that is used to buy guns for the French underground, to pay off border guards, to buy food for children in hiding. It is probably the thing that made the most difference, is to get money actually into Europe to communities that needed it. They also put pressure on neutral nations, Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, to allow more Jews over their borders, to increase their diplomatic representation in Nazi territory, in part to serve as a deterrent to violence or as a witness to it, to put pressure on the Nazis to stop the killing. They start a psychological warfare campaign. They start sending statements and leaflets and radio broadcasts into Nazi territory promising that we will have war crimes trials and will bring perpetrators to justice.
So they show what was possible.
They show what was possible and what might have been possible earlier. The success may not have been as great as in 1944 when it's clear that the Allies are going to win and we have a chit to play against the neutral nations.
And a foothold in Europe.
That makes a massive difference as well. You know, the ability to actually get to some of these places and help these people. But Roosevelt, the power of the presidency having a microphone, the power of the U.S. government throughout the world is having a microphone that countries will listen to or have to listen to.
It's one of the most disturbing aspects of all of this, the silence. Mm-hmm. The silence.
He is still the president of the United States.
So it has been a myth around for a long time that Americans really didn't know what was going on. We're talking about after the war begins in terms of the mass killings. That is also debunked in the documentary. It's been debunked by historians. But what's really strange about it, you'll see a small article on page 24. Small article. 1.5 million Jews believed murdered. Buried somewhere in a tiny little square on the 23rd page. That should have been front page material. Think about that. So it almost sends a message to the reader. Oh yeah, this happened.
In 1940 and 1941 particularly, those stories were not on the front page. And there are a couple of reasons for that, and I think the main reason is that many members of the press didn't believe it either. It seemed, as the name of Deborah Lipstad's amazing book on American press coverage is called, it seemed beyond belief. So there's that, and the mass killing, the Holocaust by bullets that is happening in 1941 and 1942 is happening inside Soviet territory. And so the news that is getting out through the Soviet Union and through the Polish government in exile. They are the ones producing whatever reporting is happening. And those are two sources that many Americans do not trust.
Yeah, it takes a government report to open people's eyes eventually, right? Wasn't it the War Refugee Board that publishes something about this? Or
the War Refugee Board publishes a report, but they publish it about 2 years after it's confirmed that mass murder is happening. Yeah. In the fall of 1944, the War Refugee Board gets a report specifically about Auschwitz. It was written by escapees from Auschwitz in the spring of 1944. It's very detailed. It's very graphic. It goes through the process of arrival and selection and gassing. There are maps, hand-drawn maps in this report. It's an incredible primary source. And the War Refugee Board gets it at the end of October 1944 and almost immediately, within about a week and a half, decide that they're going to give it to the press. So they do not ask anyone in government for permission. They give it, and they give it an embargo for Thanksgiving weekend. And so all of these stories appear the Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend, 1944, in some cases, full-page articles detailing Auschwitz to the American people. And about a week later, the Washington Post publishes an editorial called Genocide. And that was the first time that word was used in an American newspaper. And they say this word has just been coined by
Raphael Lemkin.
Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish refugee himself, a legal scholar, who is arguing that this is a new kind of crime. And that we, the Washington Post editorial board, feel that the War Refugee Board has introduced the American people through this Auschwitz report to a new kind of crime, and the American people need to learn this new word.
About not being able to believe something like this could possibly happen. That explains why in the early 1930s or in the early years of Hitler's reign, even as the crackdown on Jews begins to accelerate, patriotic German Jews who had served their country in World War I, if you had told them, this is going to get so bad, they're actually going to murder you, they wouldn't have believed you.
No, they were patriotic Germans. German Jews, Jewish Germans. Many Germans saw themselves as Jewish Germans, people who were German first and foremost and happened to be Jewish, or their families were Jewish, or had even converted to Christianity, but they had Jewish relatives.
Yeah. When I read the papers today and my eyes pass over endlessly depressing stories about persecution. Every time you see something like this happening, the Uyghur Muslims, they're not being exterminated, but there's at least 1 million of them behind barbed wire fences. We say never forget. We don't forget, but it's hard to feel like you have power to do something about it. How do you answer that conundrum?
I think we have a tendency, especially with the Holocaust, to look back and to say, oh, it's so easy to know what to do. We just should have opened immigration. I said it in the podcast just now. That's an incredibly complex thing to do. How do I, as an American, open immigration myself? I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that now.
So many people coming to the southern border, fleeing persecution or poverty or whatever in all parts of the world, and Americans don't want to open our doors to them.
Right. So we look back and we say, oh, it's so easy to know what to do, too hard now. And I think one of the things that this history teaches us, and especially the film and looking into this and studying this more, is that it was incredibly complicated back then too. But you look to the people who are establishing refugee aid groups in their hometowns to help people settle, or the people who are helping people navigate that system. Those organizations still exist. If refugee resettlement is something that you care about, you can get involved with one of these organizations. It's in some cases the same organizations like HIAS and the JDC, the Unitarians. These are still organizations that exist. But this is a massive problem. We are witnessing as large a refugee crisis as we've ever had in world history, more refugees than World War II.
That's right. In Europe right now, because of the war and climate refugees, that problem will only get worse as time goes on unless we get around to handling that issue. My final question to you is, I said before, we don't forget. We seem to just ignore it when we see it or feel helpless about solving the problem. But what about the younger generations who've never been taught? Do you feel like Holocaust education is where it needs to be in this country? Because each new generation needs to learn this story.
I think Holocaust education is incredibly important. I think it needs to be taught not just once, not just at the end of, as I was taught, at the end of World War II, the World War II unit, we had one day and we went back and then we did the history all over again, but looking specifically at the Holocaust.
A few sentences in a high school textbook.
And if you're absent that day, you don't get it. And I think Holocaust education, I know a lot of teachers and they are enthusiastic in teaching about the Holocaust and they are dedicated to spending more time with it and really getting into the how and why and the choices that people are making. But education in general is under tremendous strain. Teachers are being asked to do a lot with very little. And
they have to be careful about what they say.
And they have to be careful in some places about what they say. I know that the enthusiasm is there among teachers. They, for this and for many other things, need community support and support from people who fund education to support Holocaust education in the way so many teachers want to.
Well, thank you for doing your part and for contributing to the documentary and for the work you've done and continue to do at the museum in D.C.
Thanks so much. I do want to say that my participation in the film and my interview here is my words and not necessarily the opinions of the museum.
Rebecca Erbelding, we thank you for the work you are doing. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to turn our eyes to more recent history as we continue our conversations about populism, the current-day GOP, Trumpism, and take a look at the influence of Pat Buchanan with historian Nicole Hemmer, who has just written a book about the far right's lasting influence on the Republican Party. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.